No, but the whole preaching, like this is gonna be preaching. It's not a lecture. It's like religious preaching.
Oh my God.
I feel like I'm gonna enter the syndrome.
Yeah. I think you'll all,
Open and ready.
by the end, hopefully everybody will realize that they have the syndrome.
Like contracted tonight.
Yeah. No, it's uncontractable. It's innate, and whether it's expressed or not.
Okay.
And you'll learn. I'm excited. I hope everybody leaves and finds God. We all want to preach something. So I hope that we leave tonight with a sense of willingness and wantingness to preach. Huh? Amen.
Amen.
Slava Bogu.
Thank you, Alicia.
Thank you. All right. Thank you for being here. So Jerusalem syndrome is something interesting. Can I first ask, like, what brought you guys here?
You did.
Me? Okay. That's a lot, because I'm not going to be talking about myself. I'm going to be talking about these guys. But I guess I have a little bit of Jerusalem syndrome myself, so maybe that'll be of interest. So maybe some know, maybe some don't, but I'm from Jerusalem, and I've seen people who have Jerusalem syndrome in the street growing up, or especially in the old city, which you'll soon hear about. So encountering these individuals is also something that when you're growing up, it evokes many questions, and also definitely an instinct to research it further. So as a child growing up, I would walk the streets of Jerusalem and I would see guys, fashioning these white robes, giving public sermons, and very, very curious type. So this led me in my adult life to research this further, especially through the lens of cognitive science and neuroscience, which is something that I'm studying now. So yeah, let's talk about it. So what is Jerusalem syndrome? So it typically affects pilgrims and tourists visiting the holy city. It's a syndrome that has a very sudden onset. So as you know, Jerusalem is a holy city for all three religions, and it's very, very saturated with religious icons, with religious symbols, with environmental triggers and such. So it leads pilgrims to have a psychiatric outbreak, or to have, behavioral offset that leads them to believe that they're a messianic figure, or that they're a biblical figure, or something from the Bible. So common behaviors are cleanliness, like as biblical figures would do, or as holy figures would, which is, obsessive cleaning, social withdrawal. So sometimes they come as a group of pilgrims, and then they slowly dissociate from the group and kind of go solo, and they go in their way and start preaching sermons, and they start behaving as a messianic figure. They do scripture citation, they visit holy sites, or they sleep in the holy sites. This is also something that you would frequently see if you would visit certain sites. So you would see people literally sleeping in the holy site because they are so engulfed by the sacredness and the holiness of the place. There are some cases where they steal they steal linens from hotels, or if they suddenly have this epiphany, they'll drape themselves in hotel linens and go about the streets and preach sermons. So this is a very interesting phenomenon, especially if we're considering the triggers, or the environmental triggers of places that are very saturated with symbolic meaning. Yeah, so a little bit about the history. It was first documented by Dr. Heinz Hermann in the 30s. The first case was that they found a woman going every day to Mount Scopus with a cup of tea, waiting for the second coming. So she would show up every day with a cup of tea, and this was a behavioral pattern that was also very compulsive, that it would reoccur every day. So this is part of the symptoms as well. It's a compulsive reenactment of this biblical figure, or anticipation for a biblical figure to come, or for the ghost to come, or for Jesus to come. So she would go every day with a cup of tea and wait for him. So on the average, about 100 cases a year, with about 40 needing hospitalization. during these years, there was documented 1,200 tourists with 470 hospitalized. Especially in the 90s, there was a surge of this because it was also with the turn of the millennia, which also psychiatrically affected people and led them to heightened senses of anticipations or impending doom and such. So the 90s were especially strong for this phenomenon, and that's basically when the research on this began more profoundly. Yeah, so there are 3 types of Jerusalem syndrome as categorized by Barel. So there are people who are innately or previously very obsessed with Jerusalem. They're obsessed with the story of it. They're obsessed with what it signifies to Christianity. It's also noteworthy that most of the people who have Jerusalem syndrome in an outer, in a manifested way, they're mostly tourists from the U.S., which I think that it's interesting. And this is also why I'm giving the lecture here tonight, because I think that it's interesting how the majority of these cases are from the United States. It raises questions about, being a spiritual refugee or lacking a certain spirituality that will lead you to come to Jerusalem and reenact these figures. So it also raises deeper questions about that. So there's a type that they're previously obsessed with Jerusalem. Sorry, that's type 2. So type 1 is pre-existing psychotic illness. Oh, I forgot to mention that what's interesting in Jerusalem syndrome is that the majority don't have psychiatric history at all. Most of the cases, it's immediate onset with relatively healthy individuals. So that's a pretty striking part of it. So type 1 has pre-existing psychotic illness, religious delusions, which brings them to Jerusalem. So they live somewhere in the United States, usually like Midwest for some reason, and they already have these religious or messianic delusions, which brings them to Jerusalem following their prophecy or their self-proclaimed prophecy. Type 2 is ideologically obsessed with Jerusalem and what it symbolizes, but is undiagnosed. And then the syndrome is onset upon their arrival in Jerusalem. And type 3, which is the most prevalent type, has no prior psychiatric or mental illness, and the psychosis emerges after arrival. So that's the most prevalent type, and that's the type that's most often documented. So why Jerusalem? So as I mentioned, Jerusalem is a sacred epicenter for all the Abrahamic religions, for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. That is due to its significance in holy literature, like the Bible, but also the fact that the holy sites of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, Dome of the Rock, Western Wall, Via de la Rosa, Tower of David, all significant places that are mentioned in Holy Scripture, and that they house a lot of significance for these Abrahamic religions. So Jerusalem has all 3 of those. It's saturated with iconography, so if you've ever been to Jerusalem or you expect to go to Jerusalem, everywhere you go, or every cornerstone, or anywhere you turn, you will be encountered with something that, not every place, but especially in the Old City, you'll encounter things that are significant or pertain to religious symbols. So this could be crosses, this can be inscriptions, this can be architecture. So basically anywhere you turn, you'll come across something that pertains to religion in a very heightened way. And then you have, I just learned how to pronounce this and I forgot, but let's call it it's eschatological expectations. And eschatology is when a place pertains to the idea of the end of days, or to something that has to do with impending doom, or something that goes beyond one's lifetime. So Jerusalem holds that in across all the Abrahamic religions. It has that kind of significance, which pertains to the end of days, or to the messianic coming, or things that relate to the next world, or after death experience, or something that has to do with judgment, a sense of strong judgment. When you're in that place, you feel that you are undergoing this process of judgment. You feel that you are under the eye of God, or that you have a beholder of some sorts. So in my paper, this is also all from my thesis. So in my thesis I cite Vevzar et al., Vevzar and his colleagues, that they basically research the meaning within psychosis. They try and find what do the symptoms within the psychosis, if they have other latent meanings, rather than dismissing them as merely psychiatric auxiliary symptoms. They try and delve into what forms the meaning behind the psychosis. So this is an interesting paper, and it speaks to the fact that most of the time, the psychosis that an individual is experiencing, it will be heavily influenced by their upbringing, whether at home they were preached to, whether they went to Christian school or to day school or to Muslim school, whether there was religion in the upbringing. So the religious delusions will be heavily influenced by that, therefore making the patient or the individual way more susceptible to triggers like Jerusalem. So if you didn't grow up with that kind of upbringing, or if you don't have this metaphor of Jerusalem or of these places in your formative years, so you're less likely to be susceptible to Jerusalem syndrome or other site-induced syndromes. Making people more vulnerable. So Jerusalem syndrome's intensity is heightened ideation of this place. So you won't have a heightened ideation of a certain place. We could think of that in terms of any place that you fantasize about, or any place that you grew up thinking about, if we're talking about environmental or site-specific places. So upon arrival, you'll have heightened expectation, and sometimes this factor of heightened expectation is the catalyst of psychosis. So it's the buildup, which is interesting, and that could relate to different realms in life. So some sister syndromes that are also site-based psychotic or behavioral anomalies. One of them is Stendhal syndrome, which is also called Florence syndrome. It's when individuals, upon arrival to Florence, they are overwhelmed by the art, specifically Renaissance art. It's named after the 19th century author Stendhal, who described intense emotional reaction to the Florentine art. So people are fainting, they have hallucinations, confusion. It usually happens with individuals who are unprepared for the intense aesthetic experience. So this also pertains to the idea of heightened expectations. And upon arrival, you feel so baffled by what you've been yearning for your entire, or you've been hearing about it, and then you're confronted with a form of psychosis or delusion. It's an unfortunate thing, because it's kind of like you admire something so beautiful, and then the beauty, it wrecks you emotionally or psychologically. It mostly occurs in museums or churches that house Renaissance pieces. Another sister syndrome is Paris syndrome, and it happens mostly to Japanese tourists in Paris. It was coined by Japanese psychiatrist Hiroki Ota in the 80s. It's a very interesting syndrome. It also has to do with heightened amounts of expectation and yearning that is built up for a long time. Especially in Japan. I haven't done enough research about why in Japan specifically the idea of Paris is so built up in comparison with other cultures. Something to look into. But the dissonance between the ideation and the romanticization of Paris amongst Japanese or within Japanese culture, once they arrive in Paris itself, they have to combat a very dire disillusionment with the place, because no place really ever lives up to, what it's been, or maybe it is, but I haven't met a place. The story is always better. The metaphor is always better. But so symptoms of this are also delusion, anxiety, depersonalization. People forget who they are. Patients believe they are being attacked, or Paris as a place isn't real at all. So the disillusionment with the place and the dissonance between the idealized version of Paris, it really evokes intense hallucinations and intense anxiety, or like a feeling that one has been cheated. So yeah, this is very interesting, and it often requires clinical intervention or people to just leave and go home. So this is also an interesting topic in case anybody wants to do further research into Paris syndrome. I think it's very interesting. Yeah, also speaks to romanticization of the West. I don't know, you can name many things that this speaks to as a phenomenon, which also has to do with expectations of a physical place. So the sight-induced syndromes, as we said, it's due to symbolic overload. Symbolism can come in religious form or in cultural form, in art form. It can come in many forms. And it's a struggle to reconcile overwhelming expectation or symbolic intensity. So it's what happens in reality in comparison to what you've been building up in your mind, or the metaphor the one has been building for a certain place, which is also kind of like a prophecy or a messianic expectation. You expect all these things for a certain place to fulfill. You expect for Florence to be the epicenter of art. You hope to experience, the utmost beautiful Renaissance paintings, and there's all this buildup, and then once you meet reality, it never matches up. So it's an inability to psychologically integrate the transcendent, the idealized, or the divine experience. So this is something that Jerusalem, Paris, and Flores syndrome, they share. And as a phenomenon, I think that it's really fascinating that you have all these sight-induced syndromes, and that they all kind of, in the end, they have to all, collectively, they do deal with the expectations versus the day-to-day reality that never lives up to the metaphor that's been built. Yeah. So neurotheology, this is a realm of study. After thinking about Jerusalem syndrome and really studying the clinical dimensions of it and the cultural dimensions of it, and thinking about all the sister syndromes, so you kind of meet an end point, because Jerusalem syndrome, it's not easily categorized under psychiatry because of its religious dimensions. It's not solely like an anthropological thing, because it does have to do with clinical hospitalizations. Unlike its sister syndromes, this has to do also with like messianic, it has a messianic bent to it. So you kind of hit a wall if you try and analyze it from one dimension only. So there is this new realm in neuroscience called neurotheology. I have the definition on the next slide. It's an interdisciplinary field that links neuroscience and religious experience. So it's an endeavor to find the neural underpinnings or the neural correlates of what you would call a religious experience. So you would find this clinically studied in prayer, meditation, or mystical states. And it's an idea that you're trying to understand how the brain processes supernatural phenomena. You're not trying to pathologize it, but it's more of a mode of studying it. Because there are upsides to biologically studying things that usually shouldn't be biologically studied. There are upsides and downsides to it. We'll discuss that later. But neurotheology, I chose this as a lens to examine through it Jerusalem syndrome, because it has some interesting research to it, which I'll explain soon. So there is the Andrew Newberg research. It's a little dated, but it's an interesting research where they use MRI and they use proton fire. They use different modes of scanning, basically, to scan people during meditation, especially Buddhist monks. So as you can see, they're putting a Buddhist monk through an MRI. I don't know exactly like how they get him to meditate inside, but they do. And they actually found pretty interesting things. So they were trying to measure what are the brain regions which are most active when one is heavily and acutely immersed in meditation or in religious practice. So they found that the prefrontal cortex is involved, the thalamus, and the parietal lobe. So the prefrontal cortex, that's mostly in charge of the sense of self, the ego, or the way that one perceives oneself. You have the thalamus, which is in the middle, which is also, it has to do with instincts, and it has to do with orientation. And you have the parietal lobe, which has to do with environment, and also a lot with orientation. So the parietal lobe actually, it's in the back here, and if you were, if your parietal lobe, for instance, would stop working, so you wouldn't have a sense of orientation in space, which is an interesting thing.
That's what you mean by orientation, like your body in space?
Yeah, your body in space, like knowing front and back, knowing what's around you, positioning oneself in space. That's work that the parietal lobe does. So what they found is that it's the brain activity that was found was associated with loss of self, timelessness, which also has to do with the parietal lobe, because once that's lower in activity, so they found that the prefrontal cortex and the thalamus were more active, which is a heightened sense of reflection, and then the loss of self and loss of orientation was the parietal lobe, which kind of brings to that sense of oneness with the universe, which maybe you can relate to if you did meditation, or kind of that you merge into your surroundings. So interestingly enough, the area that's in charge of orientation was lower activity.
I have a thing to add. It's very interesting because it's like if you read into Zen texts, so they always say like you gotta go back to being a child, and it brings a memory of like it connects to like the self-object relations like when they get developed.
Yeah.
Like almost like getting back to the moment.
That you're no longer associated with the object, that you're divorced from it. So that's what happens. So in blue you could see the regions that are less active, and in red you can see the regions that are more active. So you could see this is baseline. When here you have in the frontal lobe red, which you don't have here, which is more activated, and then you have blue over here, which you don't have here, which is less activated. So you have in the parietal lobe deactivation. So the part in the brain that's in charge with orientation is less active in times of prayer or meditation. So that's that merging into your surroundings, or the oneness with the universe that some people sense during meditation or times of prayer. This is also a bunch of regions that are activated or less activated, which really it backs the idea. It's exactly what we would sense or think about prayer. It's also proved through biology, which is interesting. Another researcher was Michael Persinger, which he said that I brought the quotes because I think that they're pretty interesting, that the neurophysiological basis of religious experience in God in conjunction with death anxiety, which is also as strong as sensing God, constitute a major class of human behaviors whose frequency is rivaled only by sex and aggression. So with that in mind, he said, all behaviors and experiences are created by the chemical and electromagnetic events in the human brain. Therefore, the experience of God should be produced by the same amount of appropriate cerebral stimulation. So the idea that the seeking for God or the experience of God, it's rivaled only by aggression or by the search for sex, that it's as innate to the human spirit and to human behavior as these survival methods. So with that in mind, he made something that he called the God helmet, which is this. It looks pretty funny. But what it does is it stimulates neuroelectromagnetic processes associated with consciousness in the brain. So as he said, that if everything in the world is a play of materials in the brain, or chemical or electromagnetic fields in the brain, so will the experience of God. So he made this apparatus that mimics micro seizures in the brain, which are physiologically patterned. He put that on patients, and they sensed they reported that they have sensed a presence. So he created a physiological pattern that kind of mimicked, in the temporal lobes, he mimicked allegedly what God would feel like. So he tried to recreate that technologically. So you can argue about whether that's accurate or not, but he performed this he had 1,200 patients that underwent this, and a big majority of them did report that they had a sensed presence. So he was trying to replicate what that would feel like. This is the circuit. If anybody is, if anybody here knows electricity, this was the circuit that he did. An interesting case is Joan of Arc, who she had like divine visions and voices. She was a great leader in her time. She was followed because she had these prophecies, because God spoke to her. Later on, there were scientists that researched the trial records that she was on trial in 1431, and they found patterns that were consistent with epilepsy. So it's also something interesting if we're thinking about the biological basis of God-related experience, because Joan of Arc, she had all these prophecies, she had all these voices, and then it's interesting to retroactively, you can't retroactively really analyze old scriptures like that, but then there were people who worked on it, and they ruled that she may have had a form of epilepsy, which could explain also why she had these prophecies and voices and lights. That was all very kind of in line with what modern epilepsy or temporal lobe epilepsy would be like. Also, her religious upbringing framed that divine mission. So that relates to what we spoke about earlier, that it was the upbringing and the cultural influence that influences the psychosis or the epileptic themes. Yeah. So it raises all kinds of questions. I think that it's interesting to analyze something as divine as God, or as, religious experience through a biological lens, but it is helpful to maybe raise questions about whether certain individuals can be born more susceptible to faith. Because once you find that religion is somewhere wired in the brain, like if you can find the regions, let's say, like what I showed, shows that religion can trace back to temporal lobe activation, or a deactivation of the parietal lobe, which is consciousness of your surrounding. So once you can find that there are certain regions in the brain that can pertain to these experiences, further research can be done to see if an individual is susceptible or genetically, more genetically susceptible to religious experience, which can be interesting. But obviously, religious experience is both biological and symbolic. Also, we can't over-pathologize faith, because that could lead to arguments against faith or in favor of faith. Like, you don't want to over-pathologize anything. But these are the questions when you're combining this kind of research with biological research as well. In the case of Jerusalem syndrome, there isn't research done about it. You don't have MRIs, or you don't have anything that checks for the activation of the temporal lobe or epilepsy. But that's something, personally, I would want to research that. I don't know. It's also hard to have a lab-controlled research that has to do with Jerusalem syndrome, because it's very environmentally triggered in these individuals. It's not something that you could do in a lab like you could do with monks or nuns during meditation. But one can hypothesize that it is a combination of cultural factors and perhaps biological or genetic susceptibility that leads people to have Jerusalem syndrome. Yeah. So are some people predisposed to faith, or is faith hardwired into our genes? There's this geneticist, Dean Hammer, not Gene, Dean. He talks about whether faith is heritable, whether there are people who are more susceptible to religious experience. I feel this often because I come from Jerusalem, and you arrive in New York and you kind of like, but where's the faith? Everybody, no, is anybody into this? Like, it's kind of a strange thing to navigate. Everything is very saturated. There are a lot of factors that contribute to people being afraid of faith, or to be, I don't know, or to eschew it, or to regard it as something primitive or conservative. Like, faith is not favorably seen necessarily. So this is also why I'm questioning this, because Jerusalem is such a place of faith and religion, and then you arrive to New York and you're not sure where that faith is, or whether it manifests in different places. So this also led me to my research to check, like, are there individuals that are more susceptible? Is it more interesting to me because I'm more genetically susceptible to faith, or where does faith lie, like, within our society and within the people we know? And also the question of how do symbols and expectations shape brain response. So the symbols of Jerusalem, which are the crosses and the architecture, or the symbols of Paris, the way they are reflected, for instance, in Japan, and then manifested in a different way. Like, these are all symbolic manifestations of things that are not always attained, or it's always the idea that is building up. So that's also something to think about. And finally, I'll bring a quote from Borges, which I thought that was interesting. That he said that, this is from the Aleph. It's a compilation of short stories. It has Kabbalistic themes to it, I recommend. He said, every man is a projection of the divinity, a limb or an organ through which the deity perceives the universe. So I think that that's an interesting thing to think of ourselves as an organ or a limb. I think that also the biological terminology that he used here was interesting. To see oneself as part of this anatomy that is a divine deity, or I think that we could do it vice versa. Like, if we are the projection of the deity, so the deity also projects within us biologically and physically. So yes, I leave this as the question to linger, and I hope that each one feels, or to some capacity, maybe as an organ or an extension, or as a limb of something greater or something divine. I'll finish with that. And the next one. Thank you. This is a woman, by the way. Yeah.
Question time.
Questions.
Do you have any questions, guys? Anybody?
Yeah. It's kind of a weird question. You brought it around to a place that I was hungering for the whole time through, which was the manifestation of God in people. Mm-hmm. And how do you know that they're wrong, basically? Like,
who's wrong?
That people who have this syndrome. How do you know that they're wrong?
You don't know that they're wrong. That's why I argue for not necessarily pathologizing it, but rather like seeing it as a genetic expression, or as something that's latent and then manifested, rather than a psychotic outbreak. Because it's not in the DSM, which is like the dictionary of psychological pathologies. So it doesn't have Jerusalem syndrome in it, but it has it underneath, like hallucinations or exaggerated religious behavior. But instead of it being pathologized like that, I'm arguing to see it as maybe a genetic expression, or something that should not be that pathologized, and further that maybe everybody, even like normative, also has this expression that with some triggers can be expressed like that. I hope that answers.
It does. Just I'm surprised that was your thesis, because like at first I thought you were arguing like for a scientific cause, like it maps to this, it maps to that, it maps to that. But by the end you wanted it back around to that. So I was just surprised by that.
Because it's both. I think it's interesting to seek the biological underpinning of certain phenomena, but always that like gives ground. Like you could, anything that has biological explanation can be used for or against. Like right. It can use as it's like a pathology, or maybe it's like a natural manifestation. Anything that you map it to, people do that about, I don't know, about like queerness Or like, is being gay a biological trait? Is it nature or nurture? Like, this is the question about every phenomenon like under the sun. But once you dictate that, let's say being queer is a biological trait, that it's inheritable, that you got it from your parents and that you didn't choose it, so then that easily can be pathologized as well. They could be like, oh look, this is a mutation. So it could be manifested as something natural, or you could pathologize it. That's always the danger of researching, like giving biological research to things that are non-biological necessarily. Yeah.
You touched upon monks in a state of meditation. I wonder if any research has been done about human beings at different parts of their life, meaning, this is going to sound totally misogynistic, but women or men, I suppose, going through different phases of life as they age is what I'm thinking about. You know, my father, at his age, the fear of death, you mentioned that, or my mother going through menopause, I remember different behaviors, I'll put it that way. Mm-hmm. And as that relates to religion and religious, I don't want to call it, but psychology, religious psychology at different ages changes. Mm-hmm. When you're young and 18 and you think you're fearless, mm-hmm. versus you go through certain phases of your life later in life.
Yeah. Religion is traced to fear of death. That's why it was mentioned also in the same sentence, yeah. Because oftentimes in order to reconcile with life or to overcome hardship, so people do resort to religion. That's why they're both kind of said in the same breath, right. According to that perspective.
I just meant from a biological standpoint too.
Mm-hmm.
I had never thought of it in that
mm-hmm.
lens before.
Well, if you establish that religion is of biological underpinning, so then you can test that on
Correct.
different groups in society. Yeah, definitely.
And
at different phases in life. Yeah.
That's what I just didn't know if there was any in
mm-hmm.
the study.
Yeah, I think it's all in adults. All the studies that have been done there in adults that have no psychiatric background. So that's, yeah.
This is fascinating.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting you did mention the Holy Spirit, because as someone who is like in the evangelical church, people have this different belief system where all of a sudden it's like they operate on a different sort of, it's like two different sides of the brain almost, where you enter this world where you decide, yes, there is the Holy Spirit. It's almost like you accept 4D. Mm-hmm. And I wonder what that does to the mind.
I don't know much about I know like speaking in tongues, where you have all these like videos at churches, yeah. Where, you know, like one gets...
people get into seizure mode.
Yeah, people get into seizure mode, yeah. That they start speaking in tongues. Mm-hmm. It's interesting because that's also, it's like you don't know if that's a behavior that's happening out of expectation, that behavior will be happening. Yeah. Because often it is a public thing, like the priest will come and he'll be like putting his head on the person and the person will start speaking in tongues. So it's also kind of a mix of expectation or eschatological expectation. But I think that a lot of it has to really do, it's a mix, because it is a mix of what you and your spirit wants to do and also what's been told to you that has to happen in this moment.
What was the part of the brain you said that was more with like will or instinct?
That's the frontal.
That's the frontal?
Yeah, the parietal has to do more with orientation and space and environment.
And then there's something else.
There was the thalamus also. But yeah, but the ego and the self is like in the frontal lobe. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah.
That was really great. Thank you.
Thank you.
What's your stance on like psychedelics and their role in this? There's obviously so much like psychedelic neuroscience research happening, mm-hmm. and people report like mystical experiences. Do you feel like, I don't know, that like is sort of aligned with these religious experiences, or like,
mm-hmm.
I'm curious?
Specifically in the cases that I've studied, so they set as like a ground, as the baseline, they take people, the intake is patients that have no psychedelic background and no psychiatric background, so that like the test in the meditation state is like clean, you know, that it's like not interfered with. But the psychedelic research is a very growing realm. Like a lot of people at my school, there's a psychedelic lab, and it's a realm of study that if you would go like 10 years ago, people would say that, you know, they're just fucking around and that it's not a real research method. Now there is like growing ketamine research for post-traumatic people. So that's also, it's like a growing subject. So, but I don't know enough about like the psychedelic lab. I think that's another realm of study, but it's shown to be beneficial in treating certain post-traumatic tendencies. But in terms of religious experience, I think that they try and take subjects at baseline who are like not interfered with, so that the measurement is purely on the subject that they're trying to research. Yeah.
I will do a question. Writing the thesis, do you think it's complicated in terms of language? Because I feel like from my understanding, always with especially religious experiences, they're kind of described with like deduction, going backwards, like God is not this, not this, not this, because the terms are so conceptual and like uncomprehendable that it's hard to like put it into certain words. So like talking about such unworldly matters, it's more of a like a question about you writing the research. How do you feel about like describing something, trying to describe something that is so hard to describe?
It's definitely strange. I think that that's a little bit why I resorted to the biological basis, because it's so impossible to convey, especially for me, for like in English, that is not my mother tongue and not the holy tongue. Like what I've learned, all the scriptures and all the stories, it's in Hebrew. So it always feels very profane explaining anything in English or just explaining anything. So I think that the biological lens was one that is more permitting in terms of research. In English, yeah, because English makes sense in science, you know, but if I'm trying to explain something, you know, some biblical metaphor that touches me till the bottom of my soul, like I can't really do that in English. So I think that the scientific research makes more sense in English in terms of tackling perhaps like a fraction of what religious experience means.
And do you have like certain, it's like a personal question, do you have like certain words you found like hard to translate from Hebrew into English?
Wow.
Like those words that would have no direct like relation with English.
I need to think about that, but I think there are words, yeah, like the word truth, like emet. In Hebrew, it's like
Emet and met.
Emet. Yeah, emet
They're
is
like truth and death.
Exactly. So the letter Aleph, which is the first letter of the alphabet, is joined to the word dead, which is met. And then the word itself forms emet, which is truth. But it's only when you join the first letter, the letter of existence, the letter from which like the world was created, to the end, which is death. Met. So Aleph, like in the book of Borges, like he researches the letter Aleph and its significance. He comes across it when he finds a person like drawing it incessantly into the sand, drawing Aleph and then erasing it, drawing the Aleph again and then erasing it. So this, and then he argues for Aleph being like the source of the world, the first letter, the first Genesis. So then the word Emet is interesting because it really couples the word of the beginning and the word of the end, which is death. So like words like that, which is like one word and it can, you know, it embodies this whole thing. Whereas truth in English sometimes it evokes different things. But the letter in Hebrew, in general, like letters, also in the Kabbalah, like the letters are mapped onto the fingers, different sections of the fingers. Like the whole essence of letters is very symbolic. A single letter signifies like a whole universe of meanings, signifies numbers, angelic numbers, like you name it. It goes very deep.
But that's not as true in the English language, in your experience. It's far more clinical.
No, not necessarily. Like English is great. I love it. I'm speaking it.
No, I know beautifully. I'm fascinated by that connection. The idea that life and death in one word is powerful.
It is. I think it's also due to the fact of Hebrew being an ancient language. So is Arabic, which also holds many similar metaphors and is phonetically and grammatically very similar to Arabic. Many words are shared. So I think that this is just something that ancient languages, Aramaic, Babylonian, Assyrian, they all share this symbolic meaning that was imbued into the letters, whereas English maybe with its development didn't necessarily think that symbolic meaning was something that you need in every letter, but more in sentences and...
English is a baby.
It's
true.
ju- It makes beautiful things, though.
I'm not knocking it.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
All right.
Any more questions?
I got a question.
Yeah.
So, I feel like on paper, the Jerusalem syndrome, it sounds very innocent, over cleanliness and just sleeping at historical sites. But a lot of them are being hospitalized, so I'm wondering what's the main reason for that? Are they hospitalizing themselves, or other people doing it for them, or family members that are worried for them?
I think also it's a mixture of family members. Also, these people, they disappear for long periods of time. Imagine like they signed up like for a pilgrimage trip and then they never return. And they're off grid, they disappear. You have cases of like people biking, a guy taking a bike and trying to bike like across every single holy site in the Holy Land. So these people disappear on their families. And also they become kind of a nuisance to society in a way. Like if you see somebody lying on the floor preaching day and night, so somebody will call the authorities. And it's not viewed very favorably. Yeah. You had a question? Okay.
Any more questions, guys?
I think I've got one. I'm working it out. We have Jerusalem syndrome because there are expectations about Jerusalem, and it's a spiritually charged place. And we have Florence syndrome. We have, Paris. I'm wondering why there isn't like a New York syndrome when we've all been fed these things and mythologies about New York, or rather, even if is there a New York syndrome, or what would that look like, or are we all under it? That's what I'm working out in my head right now.
I think you already answered yourself. Like there probably is a New York syndrome. Like if you can tag, I don't know if I haven't looked it up, but there probably is. You can say that it has to do with chasing a dream, with certain material enjoyments, with what the place symbolizes across culture, across media, the media portrayals of a place, and the whack to the face that you get when you actually arrive and see that nothing matches up and that you're, trying to make ends meet in a city that's been, very idealized. So it's really a question of whether a thing, like, I think anything that you study clinically enough can become a syndrome. That's why Jerusalem syndrome is interesting, because anything that you put under a clinical lens, if you try and find subjects, if you try and find symptoms, if you try and find triggers, you'll probably find it. And I think it's very malleable, and we're probably living the New York syndrome,
It's paying the rent.
Yeah.
The people who have Jerusalem syndrome normally don't continue to become converts, or like they can't really, can they?
They get.
Or do they just go back to?
Oh, converts.
Yeah, like they don't continue to follow Judaism, or.
It's not only it's a Christian, Muslim, and Jewish context. They can practice each very heightened. It's whatever religion they come from, they usually practice in a heightened way. Yeah.
Only for a while.
So it could last a lifetime, or it can resolve after a week or 9 days or such. It's like a very big discrepancy, but it really depends on the individual, or whether they're hospitalized or whether, yeah. All right.
Any more questions? Thank you so much.
Thank you guys. I appreciate it. Thank you for coming. I have here for future research, if anybody wants, I have here some books. You have Neuropedia, you have Jung, Answer to Job, which Regev gave me for my birthday, which is the Jungian analysis of Job. I have it here. You have, this is, if anybody is interested, you have Simon Critchley on mysticism. This is new. He was just in conversation with Cornel West at Pioneer Works. I saw it, and it was a great talk on why is mysticism making such a comeback in the digital age. This is also a whole thing. It's like, why are we seeking religion now more than ever? Like, why are young people resorting back to religion? Why are we such spiritual refugees in our age? So that's also something.
Triggering for 20-year-old boys, are
No. And then you have here Poems of Jerusalem, which is a favorite. I invite you to look at it.
Certainly.
Thank you.
modern sense coming back to some sort of like non-verbal, not aesthetic, but world observation. I think it's almost like sent in with memes, you know, like pictures, everything that is unverbal, kind of. That is,
Yeah,
like
for
symbols.
sure. But we're also oversaturated with so many environmental triggers. There's too much on our plate. We're losing a sense of self. We're disconnecting. We're eating salad bowls that have been engineered. Like, of course, we'll want some religion, you know. It's like, I think we're going to see a big surge, I think, in religious practice in the next few years. This is like a prediction, but I think that we're seeing it more and more. Like, there's going to be a resurgence of practice of spirituality and religion. Also, in terms of people seeking identity or sense of self, they're going to probably be reconnecting with religion they got brought up with. I think that is something that we're going to see in the next few years, which will be an interesting journey. But thank you guys for coming. Yes. Thank you.
Grace Little announcement
Thank you.
tomorrow. And we are showing a moment of innocence. It's the Persian movie that we start our Iranian movie. It's gonna be